My name is Brian Bumbarger, and I'm a senior policy scholar in the Youth Justice Transformation team at Child Trends. I'm also the vice chair of the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Council in Colorado, and I know we have a large contingent joining from Colorado, so a shout out to my friends from the Centennial State. On behalf of Child Trends and our partners at the Coalition for Juvenile Justice, it's my pleasure to kick off a series of national, state, and local conversations and events recognizing the upcoming 50th anniversary of the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act with today's webinar. As you know, the JJDPA Act has evolved through its 50-year history. The priorities and core requirements have been added as we've learned more about children and adolescents and more about effective, ineffective, and sometimes harmful juvenile justice practices. The amount of federal funding that states receive through the JJDP Act has certainly changed over time. But the one thing that the Act created that has remained constant is the infrastructure and the mechanism through state juvenile justice advisory groups, or SAGs as we call them, to advise governors and state legislatures and to set and pursue priorities to continually strengthen the youth justice system and to be more effective, efficient, fair, and equitable, and to offer protections against any harms or collateral consequences that might arise from youth justice system involvement. And that continual pursuit is what we're here to discuss today. Before I introduce our panel and moderator, just a quick housekeeping note. We have the chat function disabled because of the very large audience that we have today. But please submit questions for the panel through the Q&A function, and we'll get to those and discuss some of your questions that you pose to the panel a little later on in the discussion. I also want to note that we will be sending out a link to access the recording of today's webinar, along with some resources to support your youth justice reform efforts after the webinar. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's panel, beginning with Shay Bilchik, who is the founder and director emeritus for the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform in the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University. Shay is also the former administrator of OJJDP, the former president of the Child Welfare League of America. John Choi is a county attorney for Ramsey County, Minnesota. He's also a board member of Law Enforcement Leaders to Reduce Crime and Incarceration, and former president of the Minnesota County Attorneys Association. Michelle Diaz is the senior director for Justice and Joy National Collaborative, and Michelle is the immediate past national chair of the Coalition for Juvenile Justice that represents all of the state juvenile justice advisory groups. The Honorable Ramona Gonzalez is a judge in La Crosse County, Wisconsin, and Judge Gonzalez is the immediate past national president of the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. Jill Ward is the director of the Center for Youth Policy and Law and former chair and current vice chair of the Maine Juvenile Justice Advisory Group, and she's senior policy advisor. And Steve Bishop, who is our moderator, our esteemed moderator today, is Associate Director for Probation and System Transformation in the Juvenile Justice Strategies Group at the Annie E. Casey Foundation. And Steve is also a longtime member of the Pennsylvania Juvenile Justice Advisory Group. So I want to thank all our panelists for being available and sharing their wisdom with us today. And I'll turn it over to Steve Bishop to get us started.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Brian. And I'd also like to thank OJJDP and Child Trends for hosting this first in a series of webinars. Really excited to talk about this topic as a student of history and one who definitely believes in the adage, you don't know where you're going unless you know where you've come from. I find this to be a very meaningful conversation, and I hope that it will be for all of you. We certainly have a great panel lined up who's going to give us lots of great perspectives, but we also plan to engage all of you and sprinkle some poll questions throughout and hear back from you on some of the topics that we're going to address over the next hour and 20 minutes or so. So just setting the stage a little bit for this conversation. And when Brian and I first had a chance to talk about it, it was really a good opportunity to reflect on the JJDPA. And, in recent times in juvenile justice practice and in certainly reform, there's a lot of attention given to what we call adolescent brain science and youth development, and really understanding what are some key differences with youth and young adults who come into the justice system. And it's interesting to think about because the JJDPA, in many ways, was kind of the first formal policy recognition of understanding at a rudimentary level the brain science and adolescent development by, stipulating things such as separation requirements from adults who are in the justice system, and more specifically, the deinstitutionalization of young people with status offenses. That key understanding that status offenses should be outside of the justice system, that young people should not be detained for those, is a really early recognition of what we all know about adolescence and that period of being youth and young adults, where we're prone to take risks, to push against authority, to take chances. These are all ways that we develop an individuate that unfortunately sometimes do result in delinquent behaviors, but understanding how so many times these behaviors are symptomatic of typical adolescent development. And so in many ways, that original JJDPA in 1974 was reflective of that. The other reflection I've had on this is also that many times policy, and I think particularly in this case with the JJDPA, is really a baseline for our understanding and for what our goals are, not the aspiration. So it set an early baseline for, as Brian noted, ways that we could keep from harming young people and young adults who come into the justice system. And it was meant to establish that baseline through separation, through deinstitutionalization of status offenses, by subsequent changes that emphasize treatment and diversion and the use of structured decision-making, and also the role that disparities play in our justice system. So, but all of that was meant to be a baseline to ensure that we weren't harming young people, not the true aspiration. So what part we want to really focus on today is like, what is our greater aspiration, not just what the baseline is. So before I get into it with the panel, the other thing I just want to talk about is, to me, the mark of any good policy is not just how it's written into statute, but how it's really taken up by the field and its practitioners. And to be candid, I think the JJDPA, even in its various forms and reauthorizations, probably has mixed results. I think there's been a lot of good that's come from it. Again, it's in establishing a baseline for all states and counties across the United States. Subsequent reauthorizations that really focused on treatment and structured decision-making tools have certainly pushed the proliferation that we see of the use of risk assessment tools, graduated response grids, and all sorts of other practices that become industry standard. But we know that that still hasn't met the mark in achieving all of our goals. And so the JJDPA has been effective in certain ways. And also what we've seen is the field hold true to those values. Even as we've seen over the last 50 years in various administrations within the Office of Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention, and even in some recent years where we've heard pushback to the ideas of raising the age and keeping young people in the juvenile justice system, where we've had questions and challenges about the importance of looking at racial and ethnic disparities in the justice system. What we've seen as a field is everyone come together and reaffirming and reasserting that no, absolutely, there is a place for the youth justice system and keeping young people in a separate system. And yes, addressing racial and ethnic disparities is still a paramount issue that we must all grapple with. And so these are all positive things that even in the face of that baseline, we've seen the field speak in unison in different ways around singular issues and reaffirm those. But we also have mixed results. As I've said, we still have far too many young people who are coming into the formal justice system as a result of committing status offenses. We have young people who are in residential care and tens of thousands of young people who are placed on probation caseloads as a result of status offenses each year. My esteemed colleague and friend, James Bell, who's the founding executive director of the W. Haywood Burns Institute, often talks about the adoration of the problem when we talk about racial and ethnic disparities. And even as we've seen states and state advisory groups become really adept at collecting data on racial and ethnic disparities, we still as a country continue to admire the problem and haven't really been able to operationalize the types of solutions that will really create an equitable justice system. So there's a lot of work that we have yet to do, but the JJDPA certainly gives us a good baseline to work from. But again, part of what we really want to talk about today is what is the new baseline, given what we know today. Now that we know, have so much evidence, and we know that diversion is so much more effective for young people, particularly when they commit low-level offenses and are at low risk for reoffense, that it's much more effective than formal prosecution. Now that we know that the evidence on probation as just a surveillance-based intervention is not effective, and that it really requires being family and youth-centered and implementing incentives and rewards for young people. Now that we know that even for young people who who may commit the greatest harm in communities, that we still should find ways to care for them and treat them in humane conditions that honor their dignity and give them opportunities to rehabilitate themselves and still be positive contributors to society. And what does that look like then when they remain in care? Is visitation with family a right, or is it a privilege? Now that we know so many more things all these years later about youth justice and youth development, what becomes our new baseline as we think about the reauthorization of the act? And then most importantly, what is our greatest aspiration as we all seek to employ the My Child test? And so that's not just a cliche, but what does it really look like to have a system of justice that we all would want for our children if they were to come into care? So with that, I want to jump into it with our panel. And I'm going to start with our former administrator of OJJDP, Shay Bilchek, and with our first question. And first question is just really quickly, what would you state is the greatest accomplishment and the most urgent challenge in youth justice reform today?
Thanks, Steve. I appreciate the opportunity to be with everybody today. I have a couple of thoughts in each domain of the accomplishments and the challenges. And I know I've got a very limited time, so I'll be kind of concise in how I describe them. But I think one of the greatest accomplishments since the development of the Act is the way we are operating in a more evidence-based manner now, that we are more research and data driven now than we have been historically. I know if you posed this question 25 years ago, it might be a similar answer. So it's a growing body of knowledge, but I think it allows us to use the research around the causes and correlates of delinquency, around the brain science, around the work around positive youth development, the impact of punitive measures, and take that and put it into policy and practice. Another accomplishment, I think, is the general and widespread understanding that we need to do our work outside the silo of juvenile justice, that we need to work across multiple systems. Kids don't live their life in one silo system. The domains of their life are varied, and we need to make sure that as things start to happen in those children's lives, we respond in that multifaceted, multi-system way. In terms of the challenges, I think what I see as a constant challenge in the 40+ years I've been doing this is maintaining the focus, keeping our eye on the ball of what we should be doing, and being able to respond to knee-jerk, what I'll call knee-jerk reactions to what are perceived trends in what's going on with youth crime. We see headlines all the time. Right now, it's all about smash and grab theft in retail stores. And all of a sudden there's a notion, I see an interview on the street of a law enforcement person saying the reason this is happening is because we're too light on kids' behavior. We need to get tough again with kids. So I think we need to maintain our focus on the data. My research director at OJJDP, later on in my tenure there, would remind me constantly that data is not just the plural of anecdote. We don't tell a bunch of stories and understand the picture. We need to keep focusing on the data. And then I think the last challenge, I think, is something pertinent to, I know, my tenure at OJJDP, which is keeping our eye on the research portfolio that emanates from that office. Now the responsibilities are split between the National Institute of Justice and OJJDP, and I think we need to see the continuing partnership between those two agencies in spearheading the research that is responsive to the juvenile justice field specifically. And I think that's a challenge to make sure from one administration to the next that focus doesn't wander. So those would be my couple of observations.
Thank you, Shay. I'm just going to go down the line with our panelists as I've seen on the screen. So Joe, I'm going to tag you in to respond to the same question. Greatest accomplishment and most urgent challenge in youth justice.
I will also try to be brief. Thank you for having me, everybody. This is such an exciting conversation, and I look forward to many more as we celebrate the 50th anniversary. I think, Steve, I'd double down on the baseline accomplishment that you articulated and just add to it that so many state laws were changed and incentivized to be changed by the original 74 Act, that I think that's really important. And as appropriations have ebbed and flowed with Title II and the federal leadership around the law, having that the jail removal, the status, the protection for status offenders embedded in state law has really been an incredible accomplishment and a part of that baseline story that I think shouldn't be overlooked, because we are sort of in a different place as far as what those basic standards should be than we were. And, the incentives to get that baked in the state and local level were really, I think, transformative and have helped sustain the act over time. I think, I would say the most urgent challenge, again, you named some of them, I think, around racial disparities. I have heard James Bell say that many a time myself. And so I think that's a big one. But I would also add to it the shift to really engaging communities and helping problem solve their own challenges with respect to children and youth. And this kind of relates to what Shay is saying about kids are not in silos. Just because they've been referred to delinquency court or in the justice system doesn't mean what got them there means they have needs. I mean, that's sort of what we're talking about, and responding to those needs in a way that is holistic, that is part of a continuum of care for the well-being of young people is really where we need to be having the conversation. And I think that's a challenge. I think state and local systems and institutions like to operate in a box, if you will. And so I think even as that is an accomplishment that Shay has cited, I think it remains a challenge to keep moving in that direction so that we're better responding to the needs of young people.
Thank you, Jill. Michelle, I'm going to tag you on.
Thank you. I do want to say that most of the perspective that I will bring into this is as somebody with lived expertise as a youth myself. So I'm going to leave all of the laws and talks to my peers, my colleagues here. When I think about this, what really comes to my mind is that it is more so promise based. We try to understand and work along with our communities, the people that are going through the systems, their family members, and put those into these policies, into the resources and the things that we're creating. So I am just so grateful that we are, working with the people that are going through this. But I do see that even though this is a great opportunity to actually get the solutions that we're looking forward to, I think it becomes as a challenge. How do you work with somebody that has been going through the system, right? How do you support them? And we have been talking a lot about this in the field for years now of, youth and adult partnerships, putting our people that have been most affected by the systems in the table with you to talk about this. But, it's not just about talking and getting feedback, right? But mentoring, supporting them, coaching them, writing that policy with you. It goes beyond to just, getting their feedback. And I think we need to do more of that. We need to do more of the brainstorming, planning, strategic, all of that has to come together collectively in order to actually move into a transformative systemic change.
Thank you, Michelle. John, same question for you. Greatest accomplishment, most urgent challenge in youth justice reform today?
Well, thank you, Steve. And it's a real pleasure for me to be on this panel. I agree with so many things that have already been said, so I'll try to take a little bit of a different take. I think that one of the things that we have to always remind ourselves is that if we truly want to create a juvenile justice system that is worthy of its name, then we have to recognize that this is a long, long journey. And it's really kind of like a marathon without a finish line, because there is so much work to do. And I agree with you so much, Steve and Shay, and I think Jill talked a little bit about this too. The baseline has been established, but it's really different for different people based upon maybe geography and what kind of maybe things are happening in terms of innovations that are happening in a certain community. And it's also very different how it plays out with regard to race, and also how we actually, who has the power to make these changes. We do a lot of tinkering with our system. I'm glad that we are more data informed. We're more connected to the research. But the truth is that oftentimes when we do these reforms, we're just tinkering with the system that we already have, that we inherited. And Michelle talked about this. If we truly want to get to a place of transformation, then we really need to be engaging our community and having more conversations, more deeper conversations. The narratives that Shay talked about today that are propagated by the media makes this challenging and difficult. But I think if we are intentional about engaging our community and listening to our community, and especially that aspect of our community that is most impacted by crime, most impacted by the justice system and the harms that have been done, that is the path forward. And it's to really to reimagine something completely different. We inherited this system of somehow that we get to the truth and we get to justice and we get to safety by believing that everything happens in a courtroom, right? Someone had talked about that we need to recognize that actually the solutions are found in communities, and to rely upon their wisdom and their love for each other and within families. And so the work to transform, there's a lot more to do. There's a definition of insanity that says if you continue to do the same thing and expect different outcomes, that's a definition of insanity. And I feel like until we can reckon with the fact that we have to really think about the underpinnings of the entire juvenile justice system, we're going to continue to be in the area of doing good work around harm reduction, being connected to data, trying to make these changes, but I think there's so much more to do.
John, lots of great points in there. Last but not least, Judge Gonzalez, I'd like to hear your perspectives on greatest accomplishment, most urgent challenge.
I think everyone has already taken all the gravy, right? Or the hard stuff. I just want to add a judicial perspective to this all, and just I'm not the immediate past president of NCJFCJ. I'm the 2019-2020 president, so I am a past president, but not the immediate. But my greatest accomplishment has to do with my judges and NCJFCJ. It cannot be understated how important it was to take status offense kids out of incarceration and confinement. And NCJFCJ has come a long way. My brethren have come a long way in understanding that we need to use the research and the evidence-based practices to do what's best for kids. Early on, we did not believe any of that. We said, I have to have something. If a kid is running away, I have to have something to put him, someplace I can hold him so that I can fix him. That's an accomplishment that I don't think happens without the act. I don't think we are as far as we are today on treating children like children in those situations if it wasn't for that. So to me, as a judge, and having been on the bench since '95 and seen the transition, that to me continues to be a struggle, because I still have some judges who think they know better and they really need that status offense hold. We need that exception, but we're getting there. We're getting there. So I think that's, from my perspective, that has got to be, for me, the greatest accomplishment. With regard to the challenges, for me, the challenge is not going backwards. I continue to see policy go back and forth, not from the core, not from those of us who are doing the work on the ground, but from those around us who give us the money, who fund our jails, who fund our social service agencies. There is a pullback to basically a knee-jerk reaction, as Shay said, about being tough on crime. You know, juvenile justice is not being easy. It's about doing the right thing so that in the long run, we are safe on crime and have safer communities. That to me is our greatest challenge.
Thank you so much. Thank all of you for that. Lots to think about as we go into our next questions. But first, as I promised, we're going to tag all of you in to get your perspectives a little bit. So we have a poll question that we're going to pose to the group. And you see this first poll: in your state, is youth justice reform addressing the most critical issues? Wait just a few seconds for some of those responses to come in. Okay, and I can't see the responses, so I'm not sure. Okay, there we go. Thank you. Okay, so you see our very scientific Likert here with emphatic no, no, yes, emphatic yes, and I don't know. And most folks are falling in the yes, that you believe your state is addressing the most critical issues. So that is promising and great to hear. Still a lot in the no and the emphatic no, a little bit more than the yeses. So again, mixed results and lots of work to do still. Okay, so as we shift, I want to jump into the next question. And I'm going to switch the word just a little bit because this came up so much as a critical issue about what needs to happen to eliminate racial and ethnic disparities. I've been chairing our state racial and ethnic disparities subcommittee in Pennsylvania for a number of years. And as I talked about kind of this adoration of the problem, and in my work at the Casey Foundation, I travel all over the country. And what's reflective of having so many different state advisory groups and 3,000 counties in the US, that you see all different shapes and sizes of youth justice systems, big systems, small systems, state run, county run. Does the state run detention? Do the counties run detention centers? All sorts of variations. The only thing that ever remains consistent are the jarring and stark disparities that facilities all across this country in every corner are filled up with Black and brown youth, and particularly Black youth and Black boys. So let's have some real conversation about how do we move the needle on this? How do we finally get a hold on this issue of eliminating racial and ethnic disparities? And John, if I can start with you, because I know from your position as county attorney in Ramsey County, this is something that you've put at the forefront of your agenda.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. This has been a long journey for me. I was elected back in 2010. So I took office in January of 2011. And I'm a different prosecutor, a different leader around this issue. The way that I looked at it early in my tenure as the county attorney was, these disparities are stark and they're upsetting, but what can I do about it? And so we even did racial disparity studies, and I could show that what the police brought to me, and if you looked at all of the racial background or the demographical information, right, whatever came in the door and as it exited the back door, it would be the same. I mean, maybe just a slight deviation of maybe 1 or 2%, but it was exactly the same. And so I would think to myself, like, this is so difficult. Like, how do you address some of the underlying reasons for all of this? And isn't this something that's being generated because of policing? I have now come to understand that type of framing and approach actually is actually making us go backwards. I think everybody has a role to play in eliminating racial disparity. We can't just put it on one thing, or we can't say that it's too big and admire the problem and not do anything about it. I think everybody in the system, we're responders to something, but we all have a role that we can play, and it's about being very intentional about wanting to actually change it. That's where my evolution came, and the way to change it is actually to share your power with impacted communities, and making certain that when we think about all of the things that we're doing in our worlds or offices or our agency, that we're doing it with a racial equity lens and utilizing the power that you have to affect other parts of the system. So as an example, as a prosecutor, I'll talk a little bit more about the collaborative review team and our Reimagine Justice for Youth in the next question. But as a prosecutor, I knew that there was with regard to non-public safety traffic stops and racial profiling, that happens. Driving while black is real. And so I recognize that I had the power to change that by saying to police that I don't want to see those cases that emanate from that type of policing, because I don't want to incentivize it, nor do I want to be a part of that. And because of some changes that we made together, we've actually reduced those racial disparities dramatically. And I think everybody in this room has some ability or power to be used around trying to reduce racial and ethnic disparity. And it's the wrong way to look at it if you're trying to be taking a defensive posture and saying that it's too big of a problem or it's someone else's problem. And so that's the key, I think, is if we want to eliminate or address them, then we have to do it head on and recognize that we all have a role to play.
Thanks, great. Judge Gonzalez, I wanted to ask you, John's talking about using his role specifically. Can you talk about your role as a judge and how do you kind of leverage that in moving the needle on disparities?
Well, there are two ways, right? There is what I do in the courtroom by example to my other judges that I lead. And there is what I do off the bench affecting the system. The high regard with which I take these issues in my courtroom is known to my defense bar, is known to my prosecution, and is definitely known to my law enforcement. So I will call out, as John mentioned, if I see what I believe and perceive to be injustices done. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I'm not going to avoid having that conversation. I'm going to call it. I'm going to put it out in the open. And quite frankly, most of the time, the individuals I'm calling out don't even realize it, right? It's so ingrained in our society that they don't even see it until I call it. So it's important to call it when you see it from the bench. And I share that with all my judges. But on the outside, I also understand that I'm part of the system. So coordinated community efforts with my prosecutor, with my child welfare and juvenile justice organizations, looking at the data and understanding that the data is just half of the story, right? As we've already discussed today, that you cannot look at this issue without looking at the socioeconomic circumstances. You cannot look at these issues and say, if people can't find housing, if people don't have jobs, if families are not provided with the assistance that they need, we cannot then expect that they're going to all be able to accomplish what we're asking them to accomplish. So I challenge my community to provide those socioeconomic bases upon which people can rise. And I also encourage the young folks that are in my courtroom to understand that they are worthy and that they can accomplish what they wish to accomplish, and that I can provide to them with the resources I have in my community, the opportunity to do that. Because hope for young kids and hope for their parents and their communities is crucial. And sometimes, as John said, the leadership has to come from other places. And I firmly believe that leadership from the judicial role is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, thank you, Judge. Jill, and I'm sure everyone is chomping at the bit on this topic, but I'll give you the last opportunity on this particular topic, and maybe talk about the role that state advisory groups can play as they have to develop plans to the governor and how they can really leverage that.
Yeah, the JJDPA really is a more powerful tool than I think sometimes people realize, especially when the resources come with it. So for all of the SAG members out there who are listening, you develop your 3-year plan. to get your annual allocation, and you now are required to develop a racial and ethnic disparity plan to reduce these disparities in your system. They shouldn't be separate. They should be integrated. Start really thinking about all of the ways you can use Title II money. And Steve, this really just picks up on what you said. Everything should be viewed through a racial and equity, a racial and ethnic equity lens, because that way all your activities are geared towards an eye to recognizing that this is a systemic, deeply ingrained problem, and all of your actions are trying to address it. So instead of siloing, I know some states, I know in the state, Maine, that I operate in, we had sort of a committee develop what we called the RED plan. And then we had our state plan, and those things shouldn't be siloed. They should be deeply connected and integrated. And the allowable uses for Title II money are vast. And all of the activities that you're in, whether it's training, whether it's program, direct service, they all should have this component to them. And if the SAG can get entities, states and providers and stakeholders thinking this way, that can be very powerful, and not necessarily knocking everyone over the head with it, but really kind of doing some education along with the way in which you implement what you are, charged to implement on behalf of the state through the JJDPA.
It's great, Jill. And yeah, I appreciate that, because as I said, I think ultimately when the field takes it up, when it doesn't become like a policy or a code that someone has to adhere to, but something that everyone really believes in, and is pushing it beyond that baseline. So really appreciate that.
Steve, can I add
yes.
one other dimension to this real quick?
Sure.
The pathway kids are following, often there's a stop-off point at child welfare or something happening in education before they hit that police officer. So I think in meaningfully taking this issue on, we need to dissect where our kids are coming from in terms of, are they largely disproportionately coming from the child welfare system? Are they disproportionately coming from kids who are arrested at school rather than put in a student assistance program? And so I think that analysis needs to get out, again, to my theme of multi-systems, outside the boundaries of the juvenile justice system, and analyze and have other systems take ownership of where they're driving a lot of Black and brown kids into the juvenile justice system who don't necessarily need to be there.
Yeah, thank you, Shay. That's a great point. It actually leads into the question, which I was going to throw to you. So if you want to expand on that at all, just in terms of how can states and advocates more effectively drive youth justice reform. And I think part of where you were going in terms of breaking down the silos between systems certainly is one way, but anything else that you would maybe add to that?
Well, I think we need to also see the JJDPA as something that isn't just a self-sustaining funding mechanism, protection mechanism on its own, that we need to think about how we, at the state level, link to other systems. So when I was the SAG chair in Maryland many years ago, I insisted, as a condition of coming on in the governor's appointment, that he bring the other cabinet secretaries into the discussion about where the funding would come from to launch our state plan, that it couldn't be just the designated state agency administering OJJDP money. So I think one thing I think the states and advocates need to do is to think large about how juvenile justice really works in a state, and the full parameters of the partnerships that need to take place in order to do the work well. And I think the other piece is we need to keep mining as advocates and at the state and local level, the research that comes out of not just OJJDP and NIJ, but from a lot of the other entities that are generating knowledge, like you have at Annie E. Casey, like MacArthur did for a period of time, and use that knowledge to continually grow our work and evolve it to be the most effective we can possibly make it. And then third, as an advocate, we need to get more money. I know it is not the answer, because we need to always work around the fact that we won't have enough. But when I think about when people say we failed because we're not tough enough, one of the reasons we failed is we have never fully invested in these systems at the level that is needed to do the work. What's the true cost of care and support these kids and families need? To calculate that out and then get a legislative body. I think this was the intention in Pennsylvania for a number of years. I don't know if it's been fulfilled, Steve, but to really provide the true cost of care and support for these kids and families. That's something that us as advocates need to be able to do and to keep pushing for.
Thank you, Shay. Yeah, that certainly resonates, and I'm sure it does with a number of folks that are on this webinar. The idea of having these fantastic plans, but other dollars attached. So that's a great strategy in terms of making sure other department heads are at the table. Michelle, you've been very active in the advocacy field for some period of time. How do you see this from your perspective in terms of not only what states can do, but advocates in particular in pushing reform?
Thank you. I think I know that money's not the answer, but money can take us such a long way. And like I think when we look at the research and just like Shay said, if we can just pinpoint where did it started, where our youth, our children started to go to a different route. And we noticed by the data, by the conversations that lack of opportunities, lack of resources, lack of role models, and not just as well as we need to have a cross-collaboration approach with everybody, not just the education system, the justice system, but like everything else, right? There are so many things that we're missing, even as I was reading one of the questions, one of the things that came to my mind is that, like our kids are not being taught, how do you do your taxes? How do you, how do you go and get a job? And like things like that, like we are just not set to succeed. Right. And I think that is just one of those things. But, if we can invest resources, if we can work collectively, genuinely, and intentionally, right? Because I do have to say that even though there's so much that we don't know, there is also so much that is out there within our research. So I always get to question this. So action, what do I do with this? What do we do with this? And I don't think there is enough of that, right? So there are resources, but are we allocating them what they're supposed to be? Like, are we, sharing with each other? Because I just feel like everybody is somewhat chasing the funds, and we get to forget of who we are and what we're actually meant to be doing. And not just that, right? As we get to move up and be in different positions, right? I think we're also, I'm not a grant maker, I can't give monies, I can only bring this perspective. But like you can still coach that person, right? I think, how do we drive this to transformation? It takes us building the leaders. And it doesn't just come with money, it comes with investing time and giving them that love that was not given to them. So, you can be that change maker, but you can also demand and give opportunities and share opportunities and share those resources that are there.
Thank you, Michelle. So much I love about that. And I just really want to underscore what I think I've heard sprinkled throughout, but you really lifted up, which is not just harm reduction, but really thinking about well-being. And even going further, then how do we promote well-being for young people in the justice system? How do we turn that into a leadership development opportunity so that they're the next advocates that are promoting change? So I really, really love that. And it's something that all of the state advisory groups I know grapple with, which is having that representation from young leaders. How do you keep them in the fold, make sure they can meaningfully contribute? And so you touched on a lot of great things about youth leadership. Appreciate that. Jill, let me ask you, just in terms of this question about advocacy to drive youth justice reform.
Yeah, I mean, I have so many answers to that question. I'm not even sure where to start. From a SAG perspective, I think some of the education needs to happen. I think we've touched upon sort of the modeling and the identifying issues and not being afraid to name them in multiple ways. I think those who work with young people too, I think there need to be more spaces created for the kinds of action that Michelle is talking about. We're not very good at this part of it. Adults, systems, institutions, we're not good at relinquishing power. We're not good at relinquishing space to allow young people to contribute. And I think those are the most powerful voices and the ones that are most needed if we're going to kind of get to the next level. And systems are just not good at this. And some of us older adults are not good at it either. And so I think there's a there's a moment here where SAGs can create that space. There are some SAGs that are doing really great jobs with their youth councils to create that opportunity. But I think the adults who are in the roles that we're in, whether it's in the courtroom, as the judge was saying, or whether it's, you know, in the state planning process, if you're a SAG, or if you are a prosecutor or a defense attorney, sort of you have the sort of case in front of you, but sort of always being aware of the information that that experience can bring to the larger conversation around systems change, and where you can influence, as the judge was saying, I appreciated this, outside of the courtroom and inside of the courtroom. Just always being incredibly mindful of that, and having as a primary goal this youth impacted community perspective that's always got to be sort of what's driving ultimately the conversation about the way that we work together, is really needs to be central. And I feel like that was a lot of words, but if you take that principle and apply it to whatever your role is, and find those folks who, you know, are adopting it as well, that's where we're going to get some power. And that's where we're going to find leadership, both in fostering the leadership of young people, but also finding the leaders in the systems who can help create that environment, is really, I think, what advocates need to be trying to do to be more powerful in making change.
Thank you, Jill. Yep. Investment in our young people, not just once they're in the system, but really in their development. Appreciate that. Okay, take a quick breather. We're going to do a couple poll questions before we move on to our next question for panelists, related to the topics that we just talked about. I believe the first poll question would be, do state agencies and advocates collaborate effectively to pursue youth justice reforms in your state?
My bad.
Sorry.
I put the wrong one up.
All good. We can go either one first. We can do both of them. So we're going to start with this one on racial ethnic disparities. Is your state effectively addressing racial ethnic disparities in the youth justice system? We'll wait just a few seconds for some of those results to come in and show those. Okay. And yeah, not surprising responses, disheartening, but candid, certainly. As we see, the vast majority of folks are saying no, or emphatically no, that their state is not effectively addressing racial ethnic disparities. Few yeses in there. And so certainly in this environment where peer-to-peer learning is so important, it is important that we tap into those examples where folks have been able to really move the needle. So definitely be interested to hear about some of those successes, but certainly a lot further we need to go. And then second poll question we'll do quickly about state agencies and advocates collaborating effectively. Were you able to get that poll question up? Okay. Thank you, Megan.
I love how she put an exclamation point on no and yes.
Yes, absolutely. And so this question really does, I think, get at this notion of community and system partnership. And I think Shay and several others, Jill's talked about as well, breaking down the silos, not working in isolation, systems of really understanding how much community needs to play a role in providing the best supports that we can to young people to really help them succeed long term. If we can see results on that. And a mixed bag on that. So again, certainly would be some fruitful discussion to hear about both what are the challenges and successes that folks have found across the country in terms of building those partnerships. So now I want to shift our question to Judge Gonzalez and to John Choi. You both talked a bit before about your roles as prosecutor and as a judge, in terms of racial ethnic disparities. I want to give you an opportunity to maybe expand a little bit on that, totally out to like youth justice reform generally. And I'll kind of shape it, or I guess set the stage with it with this. Shay talked about perceived threats and media narratives. And certainly while we are seeing some upticks in violent youth crime, oftentimes the perception doesn't necessarily meet the reality. But we also have great and deep concerns for young people, particularly those who are at most risk to be involved in community violence. And so oftentimes the reaction is one that's punitive. We also hear the word accountability a lot. But I like to think, and Danielle Surratt in her book, Until We Reckon, talks beautifully about how accountability is really a process. It's not a sentence, it's not a disposition, it's not a program that you order to, but it's really a process that I think requires proximity and credibility with those that you're seeking to work with. And so knowing that both of you from your positions see this idea of accountability and public safety as something much bigger than a sentence recommendation from the prosecutor's office or as a sentence imposed by a judge. Talk a little bit about, again, from your role, how you really can leverage and pursue youth justice reforms that aren't being reactionary and given some of the times that we're in.
John, I think that based upon the fact you're the one who brings the cases to me, I'll let you go first. And then if you could also address what I think there's a challenges here for the defense bar as well. And then I'll comment on both.
Well, thank you, Judge, and I'm happy to start it off. I think that there's no way you can avoid stepping into the conflict or the chasm that exists in America today about how we think about accountability and public safety. What it requires is just being willing to actually take those steps to change. And when I say change, I think the first thing that we need to think about is actually our own roles in the entire system in terms of what it produces. And so we've done something really interesting here in Ramsey County, and it is certainly controversial. But we embarked on a journey with our community. And when I say community, I was very intentional about including our impacted community as a part of conversations about actually reimagining a different type of system. We don't question enough our current roles and our current systems. The prosecutor, if we want to humanize the people, the young kids and families that come into the system, our own ethical rules for prosecutors say that we are not necessarily supposed to talk to the people and the kids and the families. And oftentimes, because of our adversarial processes, if the defense attorney is trying to tell us about some mitigating factor or something that we should consider, oftentimes the adversarial nature of the proceeding sometimes gets prosecutors not to believe the defense attorney. I think the road to transformation and reform is to be critical about what our current system produces. So as a part of the work with impacted community, we actually did research with the University of Minnesota to look at the past 10 years about what kind of outcomes are we getting. How many of the kids actually don't come back again? How many of the kids actually end up graduating to an adult prison situation later in life, a longitudinal type of study? And what we found is, probably to no one's surprise, but there's massive racial disparity in those outcomes. And so we then said, well, what can we do differently? And what we decided is that the prosecutor needs to partner with the defense attorney, so to allow for the defense attorney to actually be in the room to determine what we do with our young people, to actually have community in the room. Mm-hmm. I know that that can happen as a part of a court proceeding, but before it even gets there, the prosecutor in my office will make a decision if there's sufficient evidence. I mean, if there's not enough evidence, we're going to decline the case because we have no business being involved. But if there is sufficient evidence, then we actually have a collaborative review team that helps make that decision. We retain the final decision. And it truly has been collaborative. I thought that there might be a lot of conflict there, but we've actually worked out and resolved, and we're asking better questions about the underlying reasons for justice involvement. We have a better opportunity to see the young person and the family and what their needs are to ultimately try to change the behavior. We're doing, I think, better engagement of victims to maybe to be a part of, and we're utilizing restorative justice as the alternative to filing a petition. And again, I really believe that our solutions and answers are found in community, not in systems. And so giving them the power to help resolve the situation, to try to find some, making the victim whole, to allow the community to do that. And what we have found is, we launched this with great controversy, but we were committed to studying and researching the next 10 years. And so we've already got some preliminary data. And to the extent that what we're doing is some offshoot or alternative to putting the case into the traditional court system process and instead utilizing some form of community-based restorative justice, our success rates are much better. We're doing a better job of actually connecting with families and kids to get them to show up. The greatest reason for failure in the prior 10 years of our system was oftentimes kids and families did not show up, and therefore it would be deemed a failure in our system. So there's more work to do, but I think that the answers and solutions, again, are with community, and we need to have an intentional lens to think about the people that have never been invited to the table, and to share our power in terms of how we do the change.
And to me, it's about what Shay had indicated way in the first part. Those dual status youth have been, in my opinion, a mixed blessing, because they have demonstrated to us that it isn't about child welfare kids and juvenile justice kids. It's just about children. And they have a continuum of life, and we need to see them as a continuum of life. And defense attorneys who practice in front of me and think that they are, and do adult and kids, and come in and think that they're representing an adult in my juvenile justice court, are sorely wrong. And I make sure that they understand that, because the purpose of juvenile court has always been different than the purpose of adult court. We're looking about a holistic change to these children's lives so that we have productive adults. Accountability is about working with the child, having a child recognize the issue, working with that family and the community to produce a functioning adult that can be a strong participant in the community as a whole. Sometimes that's a hard thing for people to see when they're only seeing the heinous act that is in front of them. And it is my job to remind them when they're in juvenile court that that is the ultimate goal. And I'm not shy about refusing to waive kids into adult court. I unfortunately am in Wisconsin, where we still look at 17-year-olds and say they're adults and need to be put in adult court. But I think it's crucial that we have prosecutors like John that are working with the community so that we can have together, we can approach the issue of safe communities from a place that respects all of the participants, but recognizes that what we have in front of us is children. And if we don't treat them in a different way, all we're doing is contributing to the unsafe communities that child will then perpetrate as an adult. I'm sorry, but Elmo has been coming in and out of my picture, and I'm so sorry. It's kind of distracting, but Elmo has been with me for the entire time of my 28-year career to remind me that in many ways, we are all children, and that I need to be careful that everything that I do on the bench assists the child in front of me to become a healthy, productive adult. And I challenge all other policymakers and everybody else who's holding the checkbook on what services I make available to my kids to understand that. Because it is about pay me now or pay me later. And I don't like to pay later.
Thank you, Judge. I appreciate the connection between the punishment that we see and think is the fix and long-term community safety. And John also emphasizing and re-emphasizing that the solutions lie in community. I just want to call out as well that there's a real connection when we talk about this issue of disparities. It's not just disparities in terms of the young people that we see coming into the system. It really is a bigger equity issue as well. And so some of this lack of trust, I would say, that systems often have in community, there is a connection to our unfortunate history of racism in this country. One of the things I've done in my work at Casey is oftentimes going into sites, and I challenge folks to take a look at the University of Richmond has a website that has redlining maps. Those who are familiar with that, redlining was the practice of excluding certain groups, particularly Black and brown communities, from buying homes in white communities. And if you look at these redlining maps in whatever part of the country that you're in, I challenge you, University of Richmond website, and look at their redlining map, you'll see a correlation with where the kids in your system are probably coming from. And so I'm a big believer that as systems, part of this holding young people accountable is doing it in healthy ways, which includes providing them access and opportunity and connections to healthy adults and organizations in their home communities that, as you said, Judge, ultimately make our communities much safer. So I appreciate both of your perspectives on that.
Can
Yes,
I just
go ahead.
add one more thing? It's also reminding people, especially with children of color, that they are children, because oftentimes they see them as little men and little women instead of the children that they are. And I think, John, I'm sure that you call people on it often, and I do too. And I think that it's incumbent upon us to continue to remind folks that to separate the child from the act, and not to assume that what we have is a young adult when we really have a child.
Steve, if I can share just a quick observation. I love this conversation that just took place. It's a very sophisticated conversation. And as I've done my work around the country, what I see often is that the level of expertise on the bench in the juvenile court or in the family court, or who's staffing the county attorney or the state attorney's juvenile division, is not at a level that can really facilitate this kind of analysis. So I would promote the notion that we need to go back, the audience on this webinar, go back, how is your bench staffed? Do they just rotate judges through the juvenile family court? Or do they do, like you've been able to do, Judge Gonzalez, commit yourself to build an expertise and a knowledge about what goes on with these kids, to understand what it means to work with the dual status youth, for example, or some of the things that John is doing. And oftentimes prosecutors, I was a prosecutor earlier in my career, we were rotated through traffic and then juvenile, then felony adult crime. And we don't really build the expertise in that branch of the office that allows us to do the work at the level that John and the judge were just discussing. That's something we need to reflect on.
If I could just jump in also really quickly, I think all of this is really important when we talk about remembering who is in front of us and all that the judge has said. And I think the voice that's missing from this panel is a legislator, because they make a lot of decisions around money, around policy, and around the kinds of things that we're talking about here. And that can be one of our biggest challenges, I think. It's not only the stakeholders and the institutions that deal with the young people and families that come into the delinquency system, needing to sort of elevate and remember and not treat kids as adults when they're in juvenile court and all of that. But legislators need to do the same thing. They read the newspapers, they hear the narrative about what young people are doing, and they come with that baggage and lack of understanding of why we have two systems and what's going on within those systems, and don't have that holistic approach necessarily as policymakers when they've got, the loudest voice in the room in front of them that might be law enforcement, who says, help, this has happened here in Maine and communities, help us deal with this. And putting the kid in a place always seems to be the easiest way to deal with something, as opposed to what we're talking about here, which is seeing the young people, identifying the need, understanding where they're coming from, and sort of some of the racism that's built into that, and really kind of understanding that, so we get to that public safety place, so that we are restoring that kid to a place where they can be a productive adult. So I just, with my advocacy hat, this is always one of the biggest challenges of really talking to policymakers and helping them grasp all of the things that we're talking about here. And that is something we're going to have to figure out the strategies to do if we want to be effective in the ways that we're all talking about here.
Thank you, Jill. Appreciate that. And I just want to emphasize what Judge Gonzalez pointed out about how we view kids, particularly kids of color. There's been ample research to suggest that Black boys, Latino boys in particular, are viewed to be larger than their actual size, older than their actual age, and more prone to criminality. And so perceiving them, seeing them as young people and children oftentimes, honor that humanity and seeing them as someone with potential is certainly a part of it. And language is important. And so I think we've all been very intentional, even here on this panel, as we're talking about young people and youth, then not offenders, because it's important to honor that humanity. We have a few minutes, and I'm going to come back to the rest of the panel, but Michelle, I really wanted to get your take as we're talking about this idea of both seeing young people as children, as young adults and young people. But then also you talked before about lifting up their voices and leadership opportunities. Can you talk a little bit more about maybe any specific strategies or ideas you have to make sure that states are centering the voices of young people and those that are most impacted by the system?
Thank you. I want to share maybe one or two stories, and I hope they're really, really fast. When the State Advisory Group of New York presented to me as an opportunity, I said yes. And, you know, you had to go through the background and the application and all of these things that you had to do. And I remember that I had to go and get my fingerprints, and I couldn't afford a $250 train fare. So I had to walk to Manhattan for 2 hours. I walked across the bridge, and, you know, I was just maybe committed, but then it would have been a 4-hour. And when I came back, actually, the police officer, how do you get here? And I'm like, oh, I walk. And he's like, oh, do you want me to take you back? And I'm like, okay, that's great. And it saved me the time. And you know, just like those barriers that are there to be part of this high level positions where you actually has that influence, it could have easily stopped me that morning and said, I'm not going to work for 4 hours just to get some fingerprints. And I know that now, you know, as I have talked to all of these issues with my SAG, now we're able to use some of those funds, even if you're not a SAG member, you know, because you're going through the process of it. Now we're going to make it easier for you. So that's one. And then the second, I remember my first New York State advisory meeting. And I remember that I got there, and it was a 5-hour, 6-hour meeting all day. And I have always said this, and I'm pretty sure everybody released this, that policies, money is just a whole different language. And keeping in mind that I just came home a couple of months ago. I am still pursuing my GED and trying to get my life together. And I remember that day that it would have been like an hour, and I was like, I'm getting up and I'm leaving this, and I'm not going to be part of this space. I don't understand. People are not explaining, because I did ask. I don't understand life and everything with everybody, with more than 10, 15 people in the room. And I was just told we got to keep moving on. Like, maybe this is not the space for me to be here. And even though it was a bad space to be in at that time and what had happened, people checked in afterwards. Hey, do you want to start doing prep meetings? Hey, what do you need, right? And I think that really, okay, great, there is people. And as I'm reflecting that I have been part of my SAC for 8 years, I think, when I talked to the new people coming in, I said, you have to find one person that you talk to that supports you, that, you know, gives you whatever you need. That mentorship, that coaching, that just availability, showing up. And I do really want to highlight, not the specific what was said, but when I heard Judge Gonzalez, was the connection of humanity. right? And as we do this work, this is the truth that there are, and all of us are like working with government and other entities, and they have their own structures and systems. So it's hard to get away from it, but how do we actually find ways where we compromise each other or fight for it to push back so we can make it so other people have the access to it? And I just really want to say that what has kept me to keep being part of this movement and something that I try to give back to our community is being there, generally showing up and giving up that space and opportunities. So all of that to say it is, the opportunities can come, they're all of there, but if we're not there to support each other, then it's hard for us to keep our people to move on and to keep building the other leaders. So that is just everybody's job to do, to show up, be there, support.
Thank you, Michelle. Those are both great stories and reminders of two very important issues, which is at a programmatic level, not creating barriers for young people and families to access services and programs, but then also as you're inviting them to the table, making sure that they can meaningfully participate by investing time and energy. So I really appreciate those stories. That was great. So I'm going to give everyone on the panel, and actually, Michelle, I'm going to start with you, then I'm going to go down the line. I think we said I'm going to challenge everyone to do this in 1 minute each. And just name one thing that states and advocates should prioritize in 2024. I'll start with you, Michelle, or I can come back to you. You ready?
Action. Let's move away from conversations. It's lovely. I love these connections, but we have to start, even if we're talking, okay, what is the goal of this meeting? How are we going to walk away and how do we put that into implementation? And who is missing in this table, in this conversation, right? So we have actual and accurate representation of everybody, right? From the system level perspective, the actors, but also our community members, right? Because it's the whole village. It's not just the youth, the family members, but everybody else in there. So just let's move into action. Let's get this done. The need for it is way past due.
Michelle. John.
I would love to see more attention paid to community-based solutions. So when we set up the framework for funding to require, like oftentimes maybe systems will have to apply for it, but they have to have community buy-in and perspective and how they're going to engage with their community. And then just one thing that we haven't talked about very much, but the concept is there, is that when we're trying to work with youth, we also have to recognize that the most important person that can make a difference are often parents, families, caregivers. And I have had so many conversations with people who just need, it's hard to be a parent of a teen. And I think we need to do better in this country to support caregivers and parents and families and communities on that topic.
You're here. As a parent, I will second and third that one. It is a task, the greatest challenge and job probably any of us would ever have. Jill.
I think that it's this notion of child well-being being part of a continuum of care, and those who, control the purse strings, really not just investing in community-based alternatives, but turning the resources over to communities to do the decision-making about what works in their community. That's the relinquishing power part that we've talked about. That is the trusting communities part, trust and support, and really pushing institutions not to think of community-based alternatives and solutions as an alternative provider of a different kind of residential care or a program. I mean, evidence base is important. There's also a space in here for some of the support services that are softer services that are really integral to supporting kids and families the way I think John has just been talking about and we've been talking about together. So really challenging the systems that control the dollars, the public dollars that have to make us all feel like we have public safety. Really letting communities make some of those decisions in really meaningful ways. And that's a process issue. It's not, there's as much process to that as there is just paying it lip service. You really have to get at the actual decision making there. And that's, I think, also echoes what Michelle was saying, hopefully, about real action that is impactful.
Thanks. I'm Judge Gonzalez. You're muted.
Right. States, I think the priority is stop separating child welfare and juvenile justice. Start thinking about it as the continuum that we've been talking about. Have joint meetings with child welfare and juvenile justice professionals. Work so that they can work together. You can't redo the system, but it's amazing what happens when people talk to each other about the similarities of the families and the sameness of the families that they're working with. And advocates, you have a whole host of advocates on the child welfare side that could be wonderful allies in working together to provide the policyholders with the understanding that you have power and that power should be exercised for the benefit of the children and their wellness. I think that's really has to be a priority in 2024.
Thanks. And Shay.
I think, Steve, I'm looking at this as the long game. And so when I look at the ebb and flow and the progress we've made over the years, it's kind of a loop that goes up, but it keeps coming back periodically. What I would say this year we should focus on is taking what we know is effective and then making sure we codify it as much as we can through adopted, signed off policy, through regulation, through rules of procedure that dictate how court hearings must take place and get the information they need before making decisions, contemplate multi-system involvement, and then state statute. You know, we've got to codify these things so we can't see the back thing. We won't see the backsliding that we continually have seen for decades. That's what I think we should be working on, along with many other things, but as one of them.
Right. Thank you. Appreciate those answers from all of you. Okay. I think we have about maybe 5-6 minutes or so, maybe a little bit more. Take some questions. Lots of really good comments and questions in here. One thing I would have just resurfaced this. I was taking a look at some of the comments, and I know that some of these were responded to, but one that Elizabeth raised about the protections of the Convention of the Rights of Child established by the United Nations. And I was going to throw that out for folks that want to weigh in. Shay, I'm sure you've done some thinking on this, but it goes without saying we have a lot of challenges in this country, and underscoring that with what an outlier we are in many ways in terms of the way that we administer youth justice in this country as compared to other nations. Even as we've seen our incarceration rates drop precipitously over the last couple of decades, it still outpaces other nations by far. So I'll open that up for others. But Shay, if you want to maybe start and comment on that.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And I have given this a lot of thought, and I've had lots of conversations with Elizabeth about this over the years. It was my hope, actually, in taking the position at JJDPA in the 90s, that we might have had the perfect alignment of the stars. We would have had a president who would have been supportive, a first lady who may have spearheaded that agenda, for a moment in time, a Congress that we thought we could work with to that effect. And then the window is gone. So in my recent thinking of this, I'm thinking more about, let's lift up what the convention stands for, what it would require and have us do in the best interest of children, and then promote it at the state level. They have one by state after another just lift this up and address it and say whether we will adopt this for our own state standards and move it in that direction, because it really contemplates treating children as children.
Thanks. See a couple other, I'm not sure if anyone else wants to respond to that. Had a couple other questions in here that I wanted to throw out to the group. Judge, did you have something?
Can I just put that together with the last question about the emerging adult population, about
Sure. Yeah, that's where I was going.
Because if in a perfect world, I would be able to do reverse waivers for young people up to the age of 27. But I don't have a perfect world. So I do challenge judges to make sure that as they sentence young folks in that population, that they take all of this brain science into account. And we are hampered so much by the fact that we are not the sign on to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and we don't have the ability to bring kids back from 25 years old back into juvenile justice. But we can take that perspective in formulating sentences and structures that account for that, and diversion programs that account for that. So there's other ways that we can address within the confines of the restrictions that we have under the law.
Thanks. And then there was another couple, so two more I want to just take. One was about what kids are being taught as alternatives to committing crime, how we gain their interest. And I want to just throw that out to anyone who maybe wants to get into that. We talked a lot about kind of accountability and also this notion that, yeah, we do have young people in our systems who we are greatly concerned about, who face lifetimes of trauma, maybe neglect, and lots of barriers that they face in their own home communities. And my belief is that hurt people, but also the healed people heal people. And so how do we gain their interest to start to change that trajectory? Anyone can kind of chime in there.
Well, I would just say one thing to your what you said, Steve, about hurt people is that we need to then think about addressing just basic needs as well, because a lot of that trauma comes from not having those basic things in place, and whether it's food, shelter, safety, and also it starts with love, because I know this for a fact that the more people that caring adults in your life, the better off you're going to be.
John.
I would also add that it's about engaging other spheres, the schools. We really have fallen down on the job of encouraging them to be part of this conversation. The school initiatives have kind of, because of no money, right, have kind of dissipated. But it's important that the school curriculum, be at the table when we're talking about solutions for communities.
Okay.
And
Go ahead, Jill.
yeah, I'm just going to jump in with a couple of programs that reflect, I think, what we're all talking about. The youth advocate programs that have the youth advocates that work with the young people 24/7 when they're in community. Credible Messengers is a emerging program that's doing really great work where you have impacted folks who serve as those models for kids, and they are tied to community-based organizations, not probation offices first and foremost, but in partnership with those institutions that have the authority over the young people, but really putting the work in the community with community members. Those kinds of programs, I think, are where we need to lean into those hard. We need to invest in those more, and we need to understand them. And you know, the evidence is coming with those that's more rigorous, like with wraparound and some other things. But those are the kinds of, I think, initiatives that reflect the values that we're talking about what really works with young people.
Yeah, I love that. And just to underscore, yes, on the credible messengers, as I've talked about before, having both the proximity and credibility with the young people that we're most concerned about. And I think that does require a changing workforce of individuals who walked in their shoes, but are at the ready to step in place. And the other thing I would just underscore in terms of this question of how do we gain their interest, how do we change that trajectory, is doing things that are meaningful for them, incentivizing positive behavior, and doing so with things that young people actually care about. One of the jurisdictions I've worked heavily with through Casey is Pierce County, Washington, Tacoma. And they, along with others, have really worked hard to build in a case management system for young people who come into the system that puts that first lays out, if you're doing XYZ, here's the positive things, and making sure by talking to them and surveying them that those rewards are meaningful. So things like time in the recording studio, boat builders programs, paying fees for athletic leagues, but really talking to young people and finding out like what actually would be motivators for them, and kind of getting past this idea that all young people should just be intrinsically motivated, because we know that if you grow up in middle class or affluent households, you get little incentives along the way. That's just part of life. And so how do we provide those opportunities to all young people? I think we're going to close. Jill, did you get a chance to respond to? There was another question in there I think you were going to respond to. I don't know if you had a chance to hit on that.
Okay. In writing, or do you want me to speak to
No,
it here?
if you wanted, if you were prepared to respond to it, I think there's the question about.
Yeah. So there was
Go
a
ahead.
question with prosecutors, or really sort of any one entity, captures the agenda of the SAG. So I'm happy to take on that challenging question. I mean, SAGs they're governor appointed, and there are often stronger voices at the table than not. I would just say a couple of things. I think one of the ways that we try to create balance in the main SAG is we have committees that deal with RED, systems improvement, youth voice. And so we've spread out sort of the authority to bring to the table multiple issues. And so there's collective decision-making around the state plan. We have a similar process when we try to determine what RFAs go out in accordance with our state plan. We make sure that there's a balance of state and non-state people. So that includes prosecutors with community folks. This can be a challenge. I mean, I will say what has not been said is politics surround this. It's not a institution that just functions outside the scope of who's the chief executive officer of the state and who's controlling the legislature. So with the SAG, the governor appoints. And so I think what you need to do if you feel like you don't have a voice there is try to advocate for structures through your bylaws, process structures that help create more space for those decision-making points around the state plan. I know that's not an easy thing, but we've tried to create very transparent, open, and lots of leaders of committees to really try to be able to make sure that everyone can kind of contribute to the decisions the SAG mostly makes about positions they might take from a policy perspective and how the Title II dollars are spent. I hope that's a little bit helpful, but yeah.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
With that, I'm going to turn it back to Brian, but I wanted to thank all of our panelists, John, Shay, Jill, Judge Gonzalez, Michelle. You've been great and really provide a lot of wisdom and knowledge for all of our participants. So thank you so much. Brian, I'll turn it back to you to close us out.
Yeah, thanks so much, Steve. And thanks to you. You are fantastic. What an incredible job you always do in moderating these discussions on keeping things moving and really getting to the heart of the issue. Again, I want to join Steve in thanking in the panelists as well. This was really a fantastic discussion, and I hope that it sparked some ideas for your youth justice reform work, and showed you how things are going in other states based on those poll responses. For example, I know it was helpful for me as a SAG member in Colorado. And again, I want to thank the Coalition for Juvenile Justice, our partners in putting this webinar on. Certainly the National Juvenile Justice Network, which is the national network of advocates. If you're not familiar with the National Juvenile Justice Network, I encourage you to become part of that national network of advocates. I want to thank the Annie E. Casey Foundation and OJJDP. I want to thank Megan, who worked in the background, keeping this whole thing moving. It's so complicated from a technical perspective. And in particular, I want to thank at Child Trends, our Vice President for Policy, Kristen Harper, for her support for this work around youth justice reform and allowing me to be able to be involved in this work, and our team leader, Kelly Murphy at Child Trends. And a reminder again that we will be sending out a link to access the recording of today's webinar, along with some fantastic resources to support your youth justice reform efforts. And thanks to all of you for joining us from all across the country. I'm excited to continue the conversation and action, Michelle, action. We will take your words to heart going into 2024. So take care, everyone, and our contact information is in the chat there. Please reach out if we can help support your efforts to strengthen the youth justice system and outcomes for kids. So thank you all.